Picking up from our discussion on Durkheim's take on class structure, let's dive deeper into how these classifications aren't just abstract labels. They become deeply embedded in our social fabric. Think about it, the very systems we use to categorize jobs, like the ONET database or the Census Bureau's detailed occupational codes, they're not neutral lists. They actively train us, subtly and overtly, to accept the wage gaps between different categories as normal, even fair. It's like learning the rules of a game so well, you don't question why some players start with more advantages than others. Now Durkheim himself was quite explicit about this. He talked about the need for well-legitimated classification schemes, basically. Ways of sorting people that everyone accepts, even if they aren't perfectly equal. Why? Because as he saw it, these schemes prevent chaos. Imagine if every time someone felt underpaid compared to their neighbor, they just started protesting endlessly. Society would grind to a halt. So these classifications act as social glue, keeping things orderly. For many sociologists today, though, talking about legitimacy feels a bit too value-laden. Instead, they might say, look, these forces are just incredibly effective at making us accept the status quo. This leads to a big problem for theories that rely on rent extraction, the idea that powerful groups exploit weaker ones, and eventually, the exploited will rise up. If these legitimizing forces are so strong, maybe those antagonistic interests never really get activated. You can't easily build a class struggle theory on top of a system that's already taught everyone to accept the differences. The argument here is sharp. Trying to salvage traditional class analysis by just redefining class based on skill-based rent doesn't work. First, this rent often happens locally, within specific jobs or small groups, not across the broad categories class analysts usually look at. Second, and crucially, the very existence of these formal occupational categories, these institutionalized boxes, works to make those wage differences seem legitimate and dampens any potential for organized resistance. It's like trying to organize a union when the company constantly reminds you how unique and specialized your tiny role is. Okay, so far we've been mostly critiquing the big picture approaches, the ones that lump similar jobs together into broad classes or rank them on a scale. But does this mean we should just throw out the baby with the bathwater? What about those who say, forget occupations, let's look at individual jobs? Table 13.2 shows different models. Types A, C, and D are the aggregate/gradational ones we've focused on. But what about types B, E, and F, which use jobs as the basic unit? Could this be the neo-Durkheimian answer? A job, remember, is defined as a specific bundle of activities. In reality, especially in conventional labor markets, there are tons of unique jobs out there. So, theoretically, you could disaggregate even further than just unit occupations. Does this mean we should embrace this hyper-specific approach? Is more detail always better? That's the question we need to tackle. Here's where it gets interesting. Even if we zoom in to the job level, we can't ignore the fact that unit occupations, think doctor, teacher, factory foreman, aren't just random collections of tasks. They're socially constructed entities. How? Through closure mechanisms. Think professional associations, unions, licensing boards, certifications. These create boundaries, defining who belongs and who doesn't. This social clothing makes jobs within the same occupation surprisingly similar. Why? Three main reasons. First, selection. Certain stereotypes attract certain people. Sociology departments often attract students with left-leaning tendencies. Investment banking might attract those with a knack for numbers and a competitive streak. Second, shared training. Everyone goes through graduate school, apprenticeships, or specific corporate training programs that mold their skills, attitudes, and worldviews. Third, interaction. People tend to hang out, collaborate, and reinforce ideas mostly with others in their own field. So while jobs might differ technically, the occupational category provides a powerful social homogenizing force. This suggests that pushing disaggregation beyond these established occupational boundaries might not yield much explanatory power. You're splitting hairs when the real social cohesion is already happening within the occupation. So what do the proponents of these job-level models, like types E and F, actually do? They acknowledge you can't just compare every single job directly. You need some way to group them or measure them. But instead of grouping them based on these socially constructed occupations, they prefer an analytical approach. They focus on the technical aspects of the job. Is it complex? Does it offer autonomy? Are there performance bonuses? The idea is that these objective conditions shape interests and outcomes. And yes, this approach has definitely produced valuable insights. However, there's a catch. Just because two jobs have the same technical conditions, say, both involve high complexity and low autonomy, doesn't mean they form a coherent social group. Unlike occupations, these similar jobs aren't necessarily organized together. Their similarity comes purely from the technical setup, not from the shared experiences of selection, training, and interaction that bind occupational groups. By ignoring these social processes, these purely analytical models might be missing a huge chunk of the story. The explanatory losses could be substantial. Let's make this concrete with a classic example: sociologists versus economists. Both often work in high autonomy, high complexity environments. Yet, sociologists often have a reputation for being more humanistic, anti-materialist, and left-leaning in their culture and lifestyle. How do we explain this? A neo-Durkheimian would point to the social factors. Sociology attracts people who already lean that way: self-selection. Their years of graduate training immerse them in a particular sociological worldview socialization. And then they spend their careers interacting with colleagues who share those views: interactional reinforcement. Sure, the job conditions play a role, but they seem secondary to these powerful social forces. Now contrast that with economists. They often work in similarly complex and autonomous roles, yet they tend to be more conservative politically and in their lifestyles. How do we explain economist conservatism? Again, looking at the social factors seems key. Perhaps they self-select for those values. Their rigorous training in neoclassical economics reinforces them, and interacting with fellow economists protects them from straying ideologically. It looks like the conservatism of economists is socially produced, driven by these same kinds of social processes, not just the technical demands of their jobs. This strongly suggests that the purely analytical approach, focusing only on job conditions, is incomplete. So, wrapping up this point, the purely analytical approach used by Type E and F models, which focuses solely on job characteristics, is inherently limited. The categories they create, based on abstract technical conditions, lack the powerful homogenizing forces, selection, socialization, interactional closure, that actually bind people together in meaningful social groups. This critique isn't entirely new. It echoes the arguments we made earlier against the aggregate and gradational models like types A, C, and D. Those models failed because they ignored the heterogeneity within broad classes. Here, the flip side is that the job-level models fail because they ignore the homogeneity generated by social processes within occupations. Even though our preferred microclasses aren't strictly nested within job-level categories, the core argument remains. We need sociological realism, acknowledging how social structures operate at multiple levels, particularly the local level of the occupation. This brings us to a broader conclusion. Durkheim himself had a fascinating vision in his division of labor. He predicted that corporate occupations, these specialized roles, would become increasingly important, acting as intermediaries between the state and the individual. They'd solve the problem of social order by managing conflicts and creating new forms of solidarity, not just at the national level, but right down at the detailed occupational level. It's a developmental story. But here's the kicker: class analysts largely ignored this part of Durkheim's legacy. When neo-Marxist models faced challenges, many retreated to neo-Weberian ideas or postmodernism, neither of which really engaged with Durkheim's emphasis on the occupational level. So, the proposal here is to explore a neo-Durkheimian third road. This means refocusing attention on that local organization within the division of labor, the dynamics happening inside and between occupations. It's less about having all the answers now, and more about opening up new avenues for research. So what kind of research does this neo-Durkheimian third road suggest? Here are 5 empirical questions that spring to mind, each touching on standard areas of class analysis. First, empirically test if big class categories are truly adequate. Do we lose significant explanatory power when we aggregate detailed occupations? We need studies comparing aggregate versus disaggregate analyses for various outcomes like voting patterns, consumption habits, life chances, etc. Second, is aggregation more defensible in some parts of the class structure than others? Maybe the costs of aggregation are higher for well-formed non-manual classes compared to lower manual classes where occupational identities are weaker. Or is it just that academics are more attuned to occupational distinctions in familiar sectors? Third, which occupations are especially well-formed? Beyond the classic crafts, where else do we see strong, distinct lifestyles? We suspect it's pronounced where training is intense: doctors, professors, where workers are isolated or stigmatized: sanitation workers, loggers, or where recruitment is highly self-selective actors, capitalists, morticians. We need data on heterogeneity within specific occupations. Fourth, are social classes decomposing as postmodernists claim? The evidence for widespread destructuration is surprisingly thin, mostly relying on aggregate trends in voting or life chances. Does this support the idea that all structure is fading away? Fifth, does the big class model misrepresent mobility? If social closure operates mainly at the occupational level, then aggregate analyses might hide how rigid mobility actually is. Disaggregating mobility data could reveal patterns that contradict the usual convergence hypotheses. These are just starting points. Ultimately, this suggests we need to reevaluate conventional research on class effects. While big class models will likely remain dominant for a while, perhaps because they were initially designed for grand historical narratives, the shift towards explaining contemporary micro-level behavior, voting lifestyle choices, might require different tools. The current efforts to tweak and adapt big class models might be like trying to fix a square peg in a round hole. If we take the micro-level agenda seriously, if we want to understand the nuances of daily life and social organization, it might genuinely require developing new microclass models that go beyond the limitations of big class nominalism and actually tap into the local social organization we've discussed, particularly the role of occupations. So to wrap it up, the core argument here is a call to revisit Durkheim's insights, specifically his focus on the micro level, the intricate world of occupations, as a fundamental source of social order and meaning. It suggests that to truly grasp what's happening in modern society, we need to move beyond those broad, often blurry, aggregate categories and look closely at the specific, often socially constructed realities of work and professional life. This perspective offers a potential third way for thinking about class, one that bridges the gap between the overly macroscopic traditional views and the sometimes overly analytical micro-focus. Thank you.